When a tenant fails to abide by the terms of their lease, their landlord files an eviction action to remove them from the premises. Well, there's a simple way to resolve the eviction action that benefits both the tenant and landlord. How do you do this? I'm going to tell you about it right now. Hello again, I'm attorney Robert Flessas. If this is your first time here, now is the best time to subscribe, because when you do subscribe, you'll know where to go to get answers to your legal questions. In a typical eviction action, the landlord files a summons and complaint and serves the tenant with those documents to start the action. A court date is set, and in many jurisdictions, both parties appear in court on the prescribed date. The landlord is asking the court for legal permission to remove the tenant for either non-payment of rent or violation of the terms of the lease, or when the tenant fails to vacate after their lease terminates. In a lot of cases, the tenant fails to appear in court, and the landlord can obtain an immediate court order to legally remove the tenant. In many cases, both parties show up to argue their case. What I'm about to describe to you may not be available in all eviction court jurisdictions. Every state can have different eviction laws. Use of a stipulation, which is essentially a mutual agreement, can be a good solution that works to the benefit of both parties. But both parties must agree by signing the stipulation. A stipulation works best to resolve an eviction when there is a challenge to the eviction by a tenant. What is the benefit? Well, both parties avoid spending time conducting a trial on the merits before a court, especially when a tenant objects to the eviction. Well, why is this important? For landlords, they avoid a possible challenge by their tenant and the possibility of having their eviction tossed by the court. For a tenant, they avoid being immediately removed from the premises. At a court hearing, a tenant can complain about repairs that haven't been completed by the landlord, or any other possible complaint that a tenant could conjure up and plead to the court. Now, when this happens, there could be a substantial delay in removing a tenant if a tenant can prove that there are issues. If that occurs, then the burden shifts to the landlord to disprove the tenant's claims. Using a stipulation, a tenant has the opportunity to remain in the premises so long as the tenant follows through with the terms of the stipulation. It's like giving the tenant a second chance. A stipulation is something that must be entered into in good faith by the parties. When the landlord and tenant sign a stipulation, both parties must comply with the terms. If the tenant violates the terms, then the landlord can seek an immediate authorization to remove the tenant. On the other hand, if the tenant does comply, then the stipulation has been satisfied and the landlord and tenant get what they wanted and save time in the process. A stipulation will set forth terms that the parties agree to, and after both parties sign the stipulation, it's presented to the court. If the court approves the stipulation, then it's filed into the record, making it a court order, and the case is dismissed. If the tenant violates the terms of the stipulation, then the landlord can reopen the case. For example, the landlord and tenant can agree that the tenant will have a certain amount of time to pay the delinquent rent by a date certain or on a payment plan. The eviction is then dismissed based upon the stipulation. But if the tenant fails to timely make the required payment or payments, then of course the landlord can go right back into court, have the case reopened, and automatically obtain a court order to remove the tenant from the premises. If this happens, the tenant no longer has a defense because the tenant executed the stipulation knowingly and voluntarily. Another version of a stipulation would be to allow the tenant to make payments on all delinquent rent, plus have the tenant vacate by a certain date. If the tenant makes the payments but doesn't vacate, then the landlord can also go back to court and obtain a court order removing the tenant from the premises. If the tenant doesn't pay the delinquent rent according to the stipulation, then the landlord can obtain a court order to remove the tenant based upon the tenant's default. There are other arrangements that can be made between a landlord and tenant in a stipulation. I'm providing the most common uses. The importance of a stipulation is that both parties are working together to resolve their differences. I'm attorney Robert Flessas. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe, like, and share, and I'll see you in my next video.